For decades, Malcolm X has been portrayed through a single, distorted lens as an angry voice, as a symbol of confrontation, as someone who supposedly glorified violence. But what if that image was never the truth? What if it was carefully constructed, repeated, and amplified to distract from something far more uncomfortable? In this story, we begin by clearing away the noise. Malcolm did not argue for chaos. He did not call for harm. What he challenged was a double standard, a system that labeled self-defense as extremism, while ignoring generations of injustice that made self-defense necessary in the first place. When he spoke about protection, dignity, and survival, he was responding to a reality many preferred not to see. The accusation that the Nation of Islam promoted violence became an easy headline. But Malcolm X consistently pointed out a crucial fact. His movement did not initiate conflict. It responded to it. In his view, the real discomfort was not about methods, it was about accountability, about history, about a nation struggling to face the consequences of its own past. This opening chapter is not about slogans or sound bites. It is about context, about listening carefully to what was actually said, not what was claimed. Malcolm X forces us to ask a hard question right from the start. Why is the act of defending one's humanity so often misrepresented, while systemic injustice is normalized? As we move forward, this story will unpack those ideas with clarity, balance, and historical grounding, not to provoke outrage, but to encourage understanding. If you value thoughtful storytelling, historical depth, and perspectives that challenge surface-level narratives, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter. Now, let's begin. As we move deeper into Malcolm's argument, the focus shifts from accusation to evidence, from perception to structure. Having already questioned why self-defense was so easily mislabeled while injustice went unchallenged, Malcolm now turned his attention to the very foundation that claimed to guarantee equality: American law itself. On paper, the United States presented a powerful image of justice: court rulings, constitutional amendments, and civil rights legislation that promised fairness to all. But Malcolm urged his audience to look beyond the language and examine reality. He pointed to disaggregation rulings that existed in theory yet collapsed in practice. Supreme Court decisions were announced with confidence, celebrated in headlines, and cited as proof of national progress. But on the ground, black families still faced closed doors, intimidation, and silent resistance from local authorities. The law, Malcolm argued, was not failing by accident. It was failing by design, because enforcement depended on institutions that had no incentive to challenge the very power structures they benefited from. In this context, civil rights laws became less a symbol of inclusion and more a confession of exclusion. Malcolm framed their existence as evidence that black Americans were not regarded as full citizens in the first place. If equality were real, he reasoned, it would not require constant legal reminders. Rights would not need to be demanded, negotiated, or defended in courtrooms decade after decade. The repeated passage of civil rights legislation revealed a deeper truth. Equality was being managed, not granted. What made this critique especially unsettling was how calmly it was delivered. Malcolm did not describe a sudden breakdown of democracy. He described a system operating exactly as intended. Laws could be celebrated nationally while ignored locally. Progress could be declared while daily life remained unchanged. The distance between promise and reality was not a flaw in the system, but a feature that preserved order without transformation. This argument connected seamlessly to his earlier point about misrepresentation. Just as self-defense was reframed as aggression, legal recognition was reframed as justice, even when its impact was minimal. Malcolm invited his listeners to see both patterns as part of the same illusion, a narrative designed to project fairness while avoiding structural change. The appearance of equality became a substitute for equality itself. Through this lens, Malcolm challenged the audience to reconsider what citizenship truly meant. If protection under the law depended on geography, politics, or public pressure, then citizenship was conditional. If court rulings required military escorts or federal intervention to be respected, then the law was not neutral. It was selective. And if Black Americans had to continually appeal to the system for recognition, then the system had already answered the question of their status. Rather than offering outrage, Malcolm offered clarity. He did not argue that laws were meaningless, but that they were insufficient without power to enforce them. Without accountability, legislation became symbolic theater, reassuring to those who believed in progress, yet invisible to those who lived with its absence. In exposing this contradiction, Malcolm was not rejecting justice. He was demanding that it be real, measurable, and lived. By weaving law, history, and lived experience into a single narrative, Malcolm X reframed civil rights not as a completed chapter, but as an unfinished struggle, one that could not be resolved through promises alone. The story he told was not about rejecting America's ideals, but about confronting the distance between those ideals and the lives they claimed to protect. Following his examination of symbolic laws and unenforced promises, Malcolm X pushed the conversation into even more uncomfortable territory. If legal equality existed mostly on paper, he asked, then what did integration truly offer in practice? To Malcolm, integration was often presented as progress without addressing the imbalance of power beneath it. It asked Black people to enter systems that had already proven hostile, unequal, and unwilling to protect them, while offering little more than the illusion of acceptance. Malcolm did not frame integration as a moral failure of individuals, but as a strategic miscalculation within a deeply uneven structure. He observed that being allowed into a space did not guarantee safety, dignity, or influence. Sitting at the same lunch counter, attending the same school, or living in the same neighborhood meant little if decision-making power remained elsewhere. In these situations, integration risked becoming a one-sided surrender, where Black communities were expected to adapt, endure, and remain patient while the system retained full control. This concern tied directly to his critique of nonviolence. Malcolm did not dismiss nonviolence as a principle. He questioned its effectiveness when applied selectively. He pointed out that peaceful protest assumed a neutral state, one willing to protect those who protested and restrain those who attacked them. But when law enforcement and political institutions consistently sided with aggressors, nonviolence could transform from a strategy into a vulnerability. In such conditions, restraint was praised, but protection was absent. Malcolm's storytelling often returned to lived experience. He described communities where calls for calm were issued not to those causing harm, but to those enduring it. Nonviolence, in this context, became less about moral high ground and more about maintaining order. The burden of peace was placed on the very people denied justice, while those benefiting from the imbalance faced no comparable restraint. To Malcolm, this imbalance exposed a deeper flaw in the narrative of integration itself. By connecting integration and nonviolence, Malcolm revealed what he saw as a dangerous expectation: that Black Americans should seek inclusion without leverage and protest without consequence. He argued that true progress could not come from entering institutions that refused accountability, without the ability to protect one's community, influence policy, or control resources. Integration risked becoming symbolic, much like the laws that promised equality but failed to deliver it. This perspective did not reject coexistence. It questioned the conditions under which coexistence was offered. Malcolm believed that unity imposed from above, without justice at its foundation, only postponed conflict rather than resolving it. He urged his audience to consider whether harmony built on imbalance could ever be stable, or whether it simply masked deeper tensions waiting to resurface. Through this lens, Malcolm X reframed the debate. The question was no longer whether integration sounded noble, but whether it functioned honestly. Progress, he suggested, could not be measured by proximity alone. It had to be measured by safety, autonomy, and respect. Without those elements, integration risked absorbing injustice rather than dismantling it. In linking these ideas to his earlier critique of law and representation, Malcolm constructed a unified narrative, one in which appearances repeatedly replaced substance. Just as legal recognition did not guarantee protection, physical integration did not guarantee equality, until power was shared and accountability enforced. Malcolm argued, neither integration nor nonviolence could fulfill the promises they were meant to represent, building on his critique of symbolic laws. Fragile integration and conditional nonviolence. Malcolm X introduced one of his most enduring metaphors to explain why progress so often stalled despite apparent allies. He spoke of two figures operating within the same system, both presenting different faces but serving a similar outcome. One was easy to recognize, direct, and openly hostile. The other smiled, spoke the language of sympathy, and promised partnership. Malcolm argued that understanding the difference between these two was essential to understanding why black communities were repeatedly disoriented and disempowered. The openly hostile figure, whom Malcolm likened to a wolf, made no effort to disguise intent. The threat was visible, predictable, and therefore easier to resist. The second figure, the fox, was far more complicated. This figure spoke of progress, moderation, and patience, often positioning themselves as friends and protectors. Yet Malcolm warned that this apparent closeness frequently came with strings attached. Advice was offered, but it was advice that slowed momentum. Support was promised, but only if demands were softened, delayed, or reframed to be more acceptable to those already in power. Malcolm's concern was not personal animosity, but political clarity. He observed that movements rarely collapsed from direct opposition alone. More often, they were diluted from within, redirected by voices that claimed to know what was best while quietly setting the boundaries of acceptable resistance. These voices encouraged calm when urgency was required, compromise when leverage existed, and gratitude when accountability was still absent. In this way, control did not require force. It required influence. This insight connected directly to his earlier arguments about law and integration. Just as legal victories could exist without enforcement, alliances could exist without genuine solidarity. Malcolm argued that liberal support often focused on appearances rather than outcomes, on maintaining moral comfort rather than redistributing power. The result was a cycle in which black communities were encouraged to trust the process, trust their allies, and trust time itself, even as material conditions remained unchanged. What made the fox metaphor so powerful was its emotional honesty. Malcolm acknowledged that deceptive support was harder to challenge than open hostility because it created confusion. When harm came from an obvious source, resistance felt justified. When harm came through delay, redirection, or misplaced guidance, it became harder to name. Gratitude replaced scrutiny, and criticism was reframed as ingratitude. The community's energy was spent managing relationships instead of building autonomy. Malcolm emphasized that true allies do not fear independent thought or self-directed leadership. They do not seek to manage movements or define their limits. In his view, any partnership that required silence, obedience, or dependency was not a partnership at all. It was simply another mechanism through which control was exercised, this time without visible confrontation. This argument sharpened his broader narrative about power. The problem was never individual attitudes alone, but structures that benefited from imbalance, whether through unenforced laws, premature integration or carefully curated alliances, the system preserved itself by offering just enough hope to prevent disruption. Malcolm urged his listeners to measure relationships not by language, but by outcomes, not by who spoke kindly, but by who accepted change when it challenged their comfort. By weaving the fox and wolf metaphor into his critique, Malcolm X gave language to an experience many felt but struggled to articulate. He reframed caution as wisdom and independence as necessity, arguing that liberation required discernment as much as courage. In doing, he reinforced a central theme of his message: that appearances, no matter how reassuring, must never replace clear-eyed judgment about power, intention, and consequence. As Malcolm X continued to peel back the layers of appearance and reality, his attention turned inward, toward a question many found even more uncomfortable than external opposition. Who speaks for the community, and who decides that voice is legitimate? Having already exposed how laws could exist without justice and allies without accountability, Malcolm now challenged the idea that recognition from power was proof of leadership. In his view, acceptance by the system was not a reward for truth, but often a signal of usefulness. Malcolm observed that certain black leaders and public figures were elevated rapidly, given platforms, praise, and visibility by institutions that had long resisted meaningful change. These figures were presented as responsible, reasonable, and safe. They were invited into rooms where decisions were discussed, not to disrupt them, but to reassure others that progress was underway. Malcolm questioned why these voices were celebrated so easily, while others who spoke with urgency, independence, or discomfort were dismissed as divisive or extreme. This critique did not come from jealousy or personal rivalry. It came from a pattern Malcolm believed was repeated throughout history. Movements, he argued, rarely fail because they lack talent or passion. They falter when leadership becomes disconnected from the people it claims to represent. When recognition flows downward from institutions rather than upward from communities, leadership shifts from service to performance. The goal becomes approval, not transformation. Malcolm linked this dynamic to his earlier warnings about deceptive alliances. Just as friendly rhetoric could disguise control, symbolic leadership could neutralize resistance. Figures endorsed by powerful structures often became intermediaries, translating the anger and demands of the grassroots into language that felt manageable to those in authority. In the process, urgency softened, demands narrowed, and timelines stretched indefinitely. The movement remained visible, but its direction subtly changed. What troubled Malcolm most was how this arrangement reshaped expectations within the community itself. Grassroots voices, rooted in lived experience, were increasingly told to be patient, realistic, or grateful. Meanwhile, those elevated by the system were framed as the standard for legitimacy. Over time, people began to measure leadership not by sacrifice or accountability, but by access and applause. Malcolm warned that this shift weakened collective power, replacing shared struggle with individual success stories. He contrasted this with what he believed real leadership looked like. True leaders, in his view, emerged from the ground up. They were not selected for their ability to calm tensions, but for their willingness to confront them. They were rarely celebrated while active, because their work challenged comfort rather than preserving it. History, Malcolm noted, often honored such figures only after they were silenced, marginalized, or gone, once their message could no longer disrupt the present. This perspective reinforced his broader argument about power and illusion. Just as integration without leverage offered proximity without safety, leadership without independence offered representation without control. Malcolm urged his audience to ask difficult questions, who benefits from this leadership, who sets its limits, and whose voices remain unheard as a result. By tying leadership to accountability rather than visibility, Malcolm reframed success itself. Progress, he argued, could not be measured by invitations, awards, or media approval. It had to be measured by tangible change in the lives of ordinary people. If conditions remained unchanged while leaders were praised, then something fundamental had gone wrong. In connecting this critique to his earlier themes, Malcolm X strengthened the unity of his message. Whether examining law, integration, alliances, or leadership, the pattern remained consistent. Systems that resisted change often adapted by reshaping appearances, offering symbols instead of substance. Malcolm's challenge was not to reject leadership, but to reclaim it, grounding it once again in the needs, voices, and power of the people themselves. As we come to the close of this exploration into Malcolm X's vision, it becomes clear that his message was never merely about confronting the injustices of his time. It was about forging a path toward true autonomy and empowerment for Black communities, one that demanded self-determination at every level of life. Malcolm argued passionately that freedom, justice, and equality could never be fully realized through dependence on systems designed to exclude and exploit. To him, laws that promised equality were hollow when the mechanisms of enforcement were controlled by those whose interests ran directly counter to the well-being of Black people. Decades of experience had proven that civil rights legislation, court rulings, and political gestures were not gifts of liberation but instruments of conditional and limited recognition. The very fabric of American society, from its constitution to its institutions, was constructed to benefit white citizens, leaving Black Americans to navigate a world that denied their humanity while demanding compliance to its rules. In this context, Malcolm emphasized the necessity of creating independent systems that could nurture Black life, thought, and culture without interference or exploitation. This included political organization led by Black leaders accountable to their communities, economic structures such as Black-owned businesses that fostered self-sufficiency, and cultural institutions that celebrated Black history, identity, and creativity on their own terms. He envisioned communities that could thrive within their own land, governed by their own principles, with education, governance, and economic opportunities structured to reflect their needs rather than the priorities of the dominant power. Separation, when necessary, was not an act of hatred or avoidance, but a strategy for survival and growth, a chance to build societies where justice was real, equality was tangible, and freedom was actively experienced rather than promised in theory. Malcolm's message also carried a warning. Liberation would not come from waiting for allies or leaning on white institutions. True freedom required intellectual awakening, collective solidarity, and the courage to assert independence in all aspects of life. It demanded that communities critically evaluate who held power, who claimed to represent them, and whose interests were being served. By prioritizing grassroots leadership and rejecting dependency on oppressive structures, Black communities could begin to reclaim not only their rights but their dignity and their destiny. His vision was radical yet deeply pragmatic, rooted in historical awareness and the lived realities of his people. It is a call to action that resonates even today. The struggle for justice, equality, and self-determination is ongoing, and it cannot be outsourced or deferred. By embracing self-governance, economic autonomy, and cultural empowerment, communities gain the tools to dismantle the barriers imposed upon them and to cultivate a future defined by their own values, creativity, and resilience. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the ideas of Malcolm X. If you found this video insightful, inspiring, or thought-provoking, please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more explorations into history, ideas, and the voices that continue to shape our understanding of justice and freedom. Together, we can learn from the past to imagine a world built on equality, dignity, and true independence.